CIA, 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 CIA.
This is Steve Zeltzer with Workweek, and the struggle in South Africa is of great importance, the fight against apartheid and the fight to have a society where the workers, the people of South Africa, have equality. And recently, Chief Buthelezi of KwaZulu-Natal passed away, and he played an important role in South Africa, which we're going to look at in relationship to the struggle against apartheid and the labor movement, and particularly the AFL-CIO. And joining us today is David Hemson. He is a union organizer, was a union organizer in Durban of Longshore and other workers involved in the 1973 uprising against apartheid, and also the fight for democratic militant class struggle unions in South Africa. Welcome to the show, David.
Yeah, thanks, Steve.
So, David, first of all, you were involved in the formation of COSATU, the early formation of the unions, the fight in 1973 against apartheid, and the struggle of those unions. So maybe you can talk briefly about it, and then what happened politically in South Africa, and particularly KwaZulu-Natal.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Well, look, Durban in many ways was a backwater in the 1970s. And yet, within about 18 months, it turned from a place where people would, I wouldn't say exactly laugh at, but would not take too seriously. Politics happen in Cape Town and Johannesburg. But when it comes to society moving, Durban takes precedence. And we found in the 1972, that the small group that I was working with, that was called the Wages Commission, we put out pamphlets and we gave notice to workers when there were wage hearings. And in the beginning, no one took it seriously because they felt, oh, well, nothing will change. And my view, which I put forward in the Wages Commission, I think it was generally accepted among white radicals on the student area. We felt that it wasn't for us to take the action, it was for us to take action to inform Black workers about what was happening. All the information which is otherwise denied to them by apartheid and by the employers, and to make sure that they could get to their wage hearings and speak for themselves. And that would change everything. And in 1972, in June the 12th, 1972, we put out pamphlets for workers. And the same day, we had strikes in metal and other factories in Durban. And the police were on our back because they realized that wages were not just a non-political issue. They could become highly politicized in South Africa in the sense that Black workers were being held in a cheap labor system with wages ultra low levels and a system of tribal labor bureaus maintained by chiefs, and in the urban areas by white bureaucrats determined to keep the wages down for employers. And all of that came into the question in late 72 when the Durban dockers took strike action in October, and that precipitated mass strike action in the early 1973, which has made South Africa's resistance history and built the foundations for the unions which followed.
One of the issues, of course, in the fight against apartheid was the development of Bantustans in South Africa and regional control by people who supported and collaborated with the government to fight the movement to end apartheid. And how did that develop in Natal politically in relationship to the fight against apartheid and for the unions?
Well, Steve, in the 1950s, the ANC said that it was totally opposed to tribal organization and to the Bantustans, what was then called the traditional and tribal authorities. And there was an uprising in the Eastern Cape and Pondoland in particular against the imposition of that form of rule. But the ANC did not support that struggle consistently, although it was the beginning of an rural armed struggle in South Africa. And I met many of the people in Durban from Ponderland actually had full experience of that armed resistance to the imposition of the tribal authorities. And in Natal, Chief Luthuli, who is the president of the ANC, had spoken out against the tribal authorities. But there was division in the ANC, and Mandela and Tambo, and it turned out other ANC leaders supported an appeal to someone called Jabu Buthelezi, who describes himself as part of the family who were traditionally the quote-unquote prime ministers to the Zulu king. And they persuaded him to stand as the head of the tribal authority in KwaZulu and to take over and to build that authority. And they thought, in their wisdom, that that would lead to the ANC being rebuilt inside the country. Remember, there was a devastating defeat in the 1960s when the ANC supported forms of armed reaction to the apartheid regime, but it ended up with a significant defeat. Just about all cadres of the ANC leaving the country, ending up either in Southern Africa or in London or in Moscow or someone else, and then talking about the need to get back home again. Well, the point was that the struggle at home was developing. It didn't have to wait, for organization to take place externally. Now, Chief Buthelezi took over the tribal authority, and he pledged in an extraordinary oath that he took that he would both serve the apartheid regime, he would defend the tribal authorities, and he added this, which was completely voluntary on his part, that he would defend a white authority in South Africa. And that's an astonishing statement he made. The ANC pretended that he never made that statement, and they continued to support him, and they hoped against hope that he would then develop the ANC and allow the ANC to return and be a kind of internal fulcrum for the ANC. Well, what we found in the Durban docs was that at the same time as playing this game with the ANC and also with the apartheid regime, he appointed his uncle, his paternal uncle, J.B. Buthelezi, to be the compound manager in Durban, in the compound which all the stevedoring workers were housed. He disciplined them, he fired those who didn't accept white authority, and he deliberately turned the recruitment of workers from other areas to be exclusively in the Zulu heartland. In Mahlabatini, which was Jabu Buthelezi's home area, and in Goma, the king's home area. In other words, he wanted to displace experienced workers who knew all about class struggle and class organization and replace those with people who came from the rural areas. In the beginning, it seemed to succeed, but the very workers who were recruited from those areas also became class consciousness and fighters against JB. And he was one of the most hated people in the labor system in Durban. How this worked was that they would recruit, this was the stevedoring labor supply company, would go out to these rural areas, speak to the chiefs, and sign on workers who looked strong, could do the tough work of stevedoring, but had no class consciousness and would have absolute loyalty to the tribal authority. Then they'd be employed at ridiculously low wages in the Durban harbor, suffer accidents and all kinds of problems at work. He would make sure that they were denied trade union organization and that they would remain as cheap labor units, as the term was at that time. We were young activists, and we got in touch with the Durban stevedores, and through a succession of pamphlets and exchanges with them, We never met them one-to-one because they had an underground structure. On the 18th of July, 1972, we got a wage hearing called, and the workers turned out in their hundreds to speak for themselves, and they demanded, it seems a small amount then, 18 Rand a week, and overtime, and a pay slip, and a pension, and all the parts of a wage, which would contribute to their family and to the employment of their children and to a better life. Jabu Buthelezi, Jabu Buthelezi's uncle, let's remember, then started firing one after the one. He started firing those workers who were active. The workers would be called off the ships. They were told there was an urgent message for them back at the company. They would imagine there was some tragedy at home that they were being notified. They would turn up there. They'd be immediately dismissed and put on a train out of town. They were deported from the urban area using all the apartheid apparatus, sent back to Mashlabatini and Goya or one of those areas, and told never to come back to Durban. They lost all rights to return to Durban because they were, quote unquote, endorsed out. As a black worker, you were not allowed to come back to Durban. In fact, many of them did come back, and I met some of them, but then they would have to work semi-underground on a basis of what can I say, uncertain future in the urban areas. Remember, apartheid system absolutely denied to black workers the right to have an urban house and to be able to educate their kids in urban areas. That was a relationship that Chief Buthelezi had with the labor movement.
This basically support of apartheid by Chief Buthelezi began to change because of the strength of the anti-apartheid movement and the unions. And what was the reaction of Buthelezi when he began to see that the working class and the anti-apartheid movement was growing in South Africa?
Well, let's just remember that Chief Buthelezi was built up by, the US government, by the AFL-CIO, and by the bundles of organization in and around the State Department, not excluding the CIA, which made sure that from 1969 onwards, he became a leading name in South Africa. In 1972, he was declared the Newsman of the Year because he was outspoken in a certain way. He said that black people needed rights in South Africa, or there'd be violence. He always uses the term, or there'd be violence, or there'd be violence. This is a man of peace, but he loved to make that point. And that gave a kind of radical image to him, which was completely deceptive. He would demand land, and people would say, wow, that's amazing, a black leader demanding land. But yes, he wanted land for his personal and for his elite and for the tribal leaders of KwaZulu-Natal, because that maintained his popularity. And many people thought, well, that's a marvelous statement. He's demanding land. But it would mean that black people would be removed off white land to be deported into black areas. He was responsible, not directly, because obviously he didn't write those orders, but by entering into the Bantustan, the idea was that these Bantu areas, they would become black homelands, and that all black people would be thrown into these black homelands. They would add a little bit more land, which is what the issue about land was, and then all the black people would be moved there and become completely rightless in South Africa. They would have to then get passports to be able to cross the border into South Africa and to be able to get a job. So when the workers became organized, the first thing I noticed in the factories was that he would suddenly appear at the factories in nearby where I was organizing. It would come with fanfare, huge cortege and so forth, and he would be received by the bosses. And they would then give him some donation towards his political cause. He started a movement called the Inkatha Cultural Movement. In fact, it was an instrument of political domination by the chiefs. And of course, the white employers found this only too agreeable because it was not part of the union movement, which was growing. Chief Buthelezi said, well, of course, I'm in favor of trade unions, but not in the areas in which he had control. And he never supported unions in any of his speeches. Instead of that, when he had the opportunity, he took action against the unions. Could I explain how? One of his leaders, was a really important person in this cabinet, and unbelievably, this person took action and supported some of the strikes which were taking place at that time. Chief Buthelezi always found an excuse or some way of avoiding any support for the trade union movement. But when there was consistent support, for the unions, what did he do? Instead of giving support, to one of his people in his little cabinet, he fired him. He denounced him, and he said that he would have nothing to do with anyone of that caliber. So that was led to an intense tension between the unions and between Inkatha, the movement that he was building. And he insisted that the unions should join his Inkatha movement and be under his control. And that, of course, was unacceptable. I mean, I wouldn't say that the union leadership had a clear idea of exactly how to handle that. It was a very difficult issue because he would arm people against anyone who criticized him, make sure they got beaten up, and that they would not survive, his opposition.
So are you saying that he used gangster tactics against his opposition?
Yes, except that it wasn't Al Capone. It was all in the style of Zulu tribal resistance to colonialism. And this was what's so deceptive and so destructive. His impies, that is to say, marching regiments, would dress in traditional or semi-traditional outfits, carry spears and knob carries as a stick with a huge knob on the top. And beat people, beat them or stab them, and often to death if they opposed Jabu Ndlovu. And this happened particularly when there were strikes. And he did not support those strikes. He saw every strike, every youth movement which started up in South Africa fighting for freedom, he saw that as a personal attack on himself. In other words, he so identified with apartheid that he felt that this was the way in which he had to deal with any opposition to apartheid, to smash it. And he tried hard. If I could just mention one factory in the 1980s, I'm running ahead a little from the 1970s, BTR, British Tire and Rubber Factory, which was situated outside Pietermaritzburg, which is the capital of KwaZulu-Natal. And that group of workers, they were marvelously militant, great fighters. They came out on strike and demanded the recognition of the metal union at that time. And then when they didn't get support, they had support from the community in boycotting white businesses in Pietermaritzburg and elsewhere. What did he do? He sent an MPs to go and kill that leadership, which was fighting against the British company for recognition of unions and against the apartheid system. And one name we should remember and still celebrate and acknowledge was Jabu Ndlovu, who was a shop steward of the union, fought for the workers at BTR and elsewhere, and he made sure that she was put to death. We had most terrible destruction because people were wide open to the fact that you could have white policemen coming in and trying to destroy the movement. But no one had the idea, they soon learned that actually there could be black reactionary leaders and their agents coming into the unions or confronting the unions, just burning their houses, killing the people inside, and struggling to keep up the apartheid labor system, which was tottering, breaking down, and being replaced by collective bargaining a militant trade union, and the demand for democracy and for freedom in South Africa.
And the apartheid regime, of course, wanted Bantustans. They wanted people like Buthelezi to enforce the regulations and to organize against the workers' movement and the unions and the left. But you found out that there were others who were involved internationally in supporting Buthelezi. Maybe you can talk about how you discovered that and what was the role of international, particularly the United States government and the AFL-CIO in supporting Buthelezi?
Well, you know, I was declared a communist in 1974, taken out of the union offices, they told me I'd never see those union officers again, thrown out on the streets, and then house arrested. That was after about 18 months to 2 years mobilizing in the unions. And that way, the regime tried to break the knowledge and the knowledge from person to person, generation to generation, of how to resist through developing worker organization. And then we found eventually I felt I was just, I wouldn't say wasting my time, but losing touch with the movement because I was house arrested, isolated, and so forth. And people just came to see me out of empathy, solidarity, generosity. But I wasn't really so involved in the strategic discussions, mainly because I just couldn't be. I was very isolated, a bit out of town. And when I went into exile, one of the first things I did was to campaign with the TUC, that's the Trade Union Congress in London, in Britain, and internationally, to be able to ensure that where workers moved into struggle in South Africa, there would be international support for their struggle. And I went to the ICFTU, the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions. Now, they had they gave some support to the unions at that time. And I went to give a report on the development of the unions. I had some exchange and some differences with them because I felt they were had a standoff position and indirectly defending, the investment of their national companies in South Africa. But at least they were, talking of giving support to the unions. On the first day I met with the ICFTU, it was a committee on Africa, I was given a file to read by Andrew Kalimbo, who was the African specialist on the ICFTU. And he said, look, this is hush-hush. Don't tell anybody you've seen this file. Take it, read it in the hotel where you're staying, bring it back to me. Do not mention to anyone else, the contents of this file. And I was a bit surprised. I wondered what could be so secretive about it. And then I opened the folder, the envelope, and I found there a letter addressed from the AFL-CIO to the ICFTU. Now, remember, at that time, the AFL-CIO had their own idea of becoming their own little international trade union movement, or, run from DC. And they didn't cooperate with the Europeans. So this letter explained to the ICFTU that the AFL-CIO was not interested in supporting the workers' struggle in South Africa, which had opened up in 1973. I was there in 1976, in other words, 3 years later. Instead of that, they wanted to give $1 million to Chief Buthelezi to organize trade unions. I was so astonished. In fact, in the beginning, I just laughed at the idea. It was bizarre. In other words, someone who was putting his uncle in place and firing workers and disciplining them, recruiting them, taxing them, and stealing their money in one way or the other, was actually going to be supported as a leader of black trade unions. It seemed so astonishing. I didn't really make more of a fuss about it. I thought it's just crazy. The AFL-CIO is doing its own thing. And but I kept it in the back of my head. I entered it into a report I made to the trade unions. in South Africa, but I didn't think of it too much. But then, when I found that in 1982, the AFL-CIO gave an award to Chief Buthelezi, and then later visited South Africa, I realized the game. In other words, they, despite whatever contact they had with black trade unions, and they were, the movement had grown by the 1980s, they were putting their money, and lots of it, into Inkatha, which was an anti-worker, anti-trade union organization. It didn't occur to me further. It seemed such a crazy award that not even the most compromised, not even the most collaborative of the unions in South Africa thought it was a good idea, giving an award to Buthelezi. Not a single union thought it was a good idea. They all felt it was incongruous. It had nothing to do with the workers' movement, and indeed it didn't. What it had to do was against the workers' movement. Yes, that was it. And in 1985, COSATU was launched. Chief Buthelezi obviously was furious because Inkatha was based in and around Durban, and the union was launched in Durban. And that got his blood, running. And there were interactions of, violent interaction. And then in May Day 1986, it launched a so-called union. I'd say so-called because it wasn't a union. It was made up of businessmen, odds and sods, and the impis, his militarized tribal groupings. And Iwusa then launched attack after attack on workers' movement, particularly those workers who were in strike, and particularly those workers in the stevedoring industry in Durban. And many made it home, but then were killed, for taking a stand and joining a radical, a militant union. And Chief Buthelezi got his vengeance through his impis. Later, that became, a huge issue. He once went to a university in Zululand, if you could use the term KwaZulu-Natal. He wanted to receive some honorary award, and the students protested. He sent an impi, and I think he killed 7 of the students. I mean, the man, he was described by the United States as a man of peace. No one got that, no one recognized, that appellation. He was a man of war, violently hostile to anyone who dared criticize him, with a massive ego, and paid by the apartheid regime. And as we later found out, given his impis were given military training in Namibia, as it turned out, and then returned to KwaZulu-Natal, and then became expert killers of the youth, particularly, but also of the workers. People could not understand how there could be any support for Buthelezi internationally, or from the liberals internally in South Africa. It was a total disgrace to the name liberal that they ended up supporting Chief Buthelezi out of a fear of the revolution in South Africa. Instead of embracing change, they resisted it, and that treachery has meant that the ideas of liberalism in South Africa have always been eternally tarnished by this treachery and the support for violence against ordinary working people.
And when you saw this document of $1 million, I guess you didn't realize at the time it was coming from the CIA to the AFL-CIO and then to Buthelezi. What did you tell them, the ICFTU? Did you tell them that they should not do that?
Well, I did mention it. Well, first of all, to Andrew Kalimba, I said, these guys are out of their mind. And by the way, if we find out about this, you'll be totally denounced, because everybody knows, what's happening with Buthelezi. The idea is beyond belief that you should even consider this. And I said to the trade unionists, and some were from Denmark, from Sweden, from Germany, and a few other of smaller European countries, but the more liberal pseudo-socialist type, of states at that time. I said, if you support that, you're supporting a river of blood in South Africa, and it's workers' blood that's going to get spilt. And they were rather curious because they couldn't believe that the AFL-CIO would do this either. So it was a very extraordinary time, and I put it in the back of my mind. I never really entertained it again, but it was obvious that some intelligence organization was working away. I can say that subsequent and quite recently, I've found out that the Durban Consul General, which was quite a large establishment of the United States diplomacy, was a host to some extraordinary figures, over time, including some of the top CIA figures, of the time, and that Chief Buthelezi used to stay there. In fact, when I remember once when someone was wanting to contact Buthelezi, it said, no, don't bother going up to Ngoye, which is, in the distant rural area. They say, just go to the Consul General, give them a call, and they will arrange a meeting. He lived right there with the Consul General. Palatial place, of course, fantastic view over the harbor, cocktail parties and all the rest of it. And a durable interest from America, which has actually puzzled me because I knew all that intimately, and I never imagined that Durban was so central in what was happening. But I think it was that the CIA, American intelligence, and probably British intelligence, identified the Zulu people, if they could be housed in a tribal group and locked into that understanding, that level of consciousness, they could become a powerful reactionary force in South Africa, as Buthelezi showed. And that was a deadly combination. Subsequently, I've also found that Buthelezi made many trips to America and elsewhere, paid for by various groups which were associated one way or the other with the State Department or directly with the CIA. The Africa American Institute and other bodies paid for his trips, gave him a personal per diem, met all his additional costs, and brought him to Washington, and also took him through a grand tour in 1973 of Africa, starting in Addis Ababa, and then coming down to Kenya, to Tanzania, and then to Zambia, all expenses paid. And then he came back triumphant that he'd been able to tour Africa, and he had visited the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, promoting the Bantustans and saying they should be recognized. What a triumph for the regime, which was denying that there was, any problem with the Bantustans, and that this was the way forward. It cemented apartheid in place and the divisions among the African people. Some astonishing developments, which were then rammed down our throats. Well, of course, we spat it out again. But it really was an attempt to break the movement inside South Africa and to bring devastation to the labor movement, which is struggling against the apartheid system.
In 1973, I understand he came to Washington, D.C. and met with Henry Kissinger.
I think the meeting with Kissinger was probably a bit later, but he was invited by Nixon to a prayer breakfast. Can you believe it? At some exclusive hotel. And Nixon made a personal tribute to the man in welcoming the guests. He then spoke at a meeting at which there were black radicals from the student movement and people who were in support of the ANC. And he put forward a position that struggle against the regime. Any form of armed resistance to the regime was totally impossible. It would be a total disaster. And anyone who said that they supported armed struggle against apartheid would be responsible for the death of African people. That's the way he presented it. That people who were supported sanctions against South Africa, and remember that was the issue of the time, economic and financial and other political sanctions against apartheid, were robbing African workers of jobs. That's the way he put it. You are robbing my people of their jobs. And he defended in every way the existing regime, although he was clever enough to make some critical remarks about how he personally was not respected by the white regime and so forth. He needed land, and a couple of those things were also thrown in. And in the end, one of the South African journalists said this was the greatest gift that America could give to the apartheid regime, to have a black man, stand up and attack the international movement against apartheid and deal it a devastating blow. That's how it was written. And, we in South Africa didn't follow all that quite as closely as we should have. But obviously, there was a method there. There was a method in that madness, and that was what was carried through. His support from the United States involved the advocacy of federal solution to South Africa. What would be federal? A federal group would have been all the Bantustans, all the tribal entities would be put together in a constellation of states, and then there'd be a passport. A black worker would have to have a passport to be able to visit a white area, just exactly what the apartheid regime was trying to achieve. And he put this forward in a kind of liberal language, as though this would bring liberation and freedom to African people. In fact, it was support for exactly the ideas that apartheid regime and America at that time supported, particularly in the 1970s and 80s.
And the Reconciliation Commission that was put up had a lot of testimony of workers that were killed, families that were killed by Buthelezis. The IFP, that was Buthelezis group. Politically, what role did they play in the working class in South Africa? Buthelezi
was one of those who refused to give evidence to the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this was not surprising in a way, because he had far too much, to say, really. So he obviously wanted to say nothing, so they could never trap him with a question or some concession and so forth. He refused to acknowledge that his impies were trained in Namibia, that he had money from the CIA. That was not even alleged against him, although it's obvious that it was true. And that he'd received, large tranches of money from the state itself to launch Awusa and to be able to carry on the war, what he called the People's War, against the comrades. Now, he refused to speak, and unfortunately, the ANC accepted that. In a way, they said he should give evidence, but when he didn't, instead of condemning this, he was appointed as Minister of Home Affairs in the first cabinet, the second, and the third cabinet. In other words, he was cemented into the ruling strata in South Africa, to the humiliation and the degradation of hundreds of thousands of people who've suffered in the whip of counter-revolution.
So the Mandela government, you're saying, actually put him in charge of police services in South Africa in the new government?
Not directly the police services, but all the identity documents. In other words, a top security department. In other words, you had to be registered. He would, I think by the time he got to it, they already started to abolish the pass laws, which were only applied to black people. But it was, I think, the third top position in a cabinet. He would be, after finance and the prime minister himself, Home Affairs decides who's a citizen, who's not. who's coming into South Africa and who's not. It decides every single detail, like Homeland Affairs in America. It's that sort of that standing. And this is, beyond belief. In a way, he kept quiet while people said, "Oh, this is clever. The ANC is now getting him locking him into a position, and he won't go around, causing violence." Far from it. Violence actually increased in parts of KwaZulu-Natal after he had that position. And I helped in the south of what we call the south coast of KwaZulu-Natal and in other areas, organizing self-defense units against the militias that were coming, to destroy various communities which were identified as radical communities supporting the ANC. Unbelievably, the ANC did not put down a defense there. Ordinary people had to do it themselves.
So are you saying that Mandela had to be aware of the role of Buthelezi and his gangs murdering people? Thousands of workers were murdered because of Buthelezi and funding from the United States and training, military training. Are you saying that Mandela put him in a position of power and that these murders and terrorism were going on under the Mandela government, knowing that this guy was basically a terrorist and a racist?
Well, the problem was the ANC had such a defeat in the 1960s, and particularly after Sharpeville and its banning and so forth, that even the wisest, or let me say the most authoritative figures of the ANC felt that and felt they had to have some form of ally. There were two options to them. Either they could support the workers' movement as exploded in 1973, but that meant that the ANC would have to become a kind of a workers' movement and accept that the working class was the base for that movement, or they could work indirectly through someone like Buthelezi, who is appointed by the apartheid state and then has ways of controlling, I think, something like 5 million Zulu-speaking people of the time, and directing them what to do. And I'm astonished to read in the papers of the time of the ANC, they never really regarded his tribal identity, which he pushed all the time, as an obstruction. But obviously it was a massive obstruction to Black unity. When someone would regard themselves as a Zulu person, as opposed to a Sotho person or a Ponda person or a Xhosa person and the like. In other words, it's effectively dividing up, Black unity. This was pointed out by Black consciousness, but the ANC never gave regard to Black consciousness and didn't take that issue seriously. It's astonishing when you read the documents of that time. So Buthelezi was clever enough to demand that Mandela should be released from prison, because that gave him a radical chic. It could say, well, look, you might think I'm selling out and this and that. You might think I'm accepting money from the regime, but, every teacher accepts money from the regime. And, so please don't play with me, because I'm asking that Mandela should be released. He asked in the politest form that Mandela should be released. Obviously, Mandela would not be released unless there was mass struggle, bringing the regime to its knees or pulverizing it completely, and then, Mandela could be released. He didn't support any of those mass struggles. It was going to be through his letter writing and flamboyant appeals, for this person or that person to be released. That's the way he saw the issue. And unfortunately, if you go through Mandela's biography, which everyone should, and look for the name Buthelezi, there's only praise for the man. Nothing about, this horrific history. And I know from speaking to people in Robben Island, there were huge divisions in the ANC over just that. Unfortunately, even a great man like Mandela can have great faults. And that was a devastating fault, which we're regretting to this day. 50 years after the 1973 strikes, we are now burying Buthelezi, but his legacy of division of tribalism, of xenophobia, and of opposition to a lively, growing labor movement is as much in place as before.
And the role of the COSATU and the South African Communist Party in relationship to Buthelezi, what role did they play in the ANC? They were part of the ANC in relationship to Buthelezi and the continued murders and terrorism against workers and unionists in South Africa.
Well. You know, I was expelled from the ANC in 1979, in December 1979, when I was teaching at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And that night, I mean, it's very curious. I met Joe Slobo, who was head of the Revolutionary Committee. Can you imagine? He was the top guerrilla of South Africa. And he was furious with me and said that I'd caused these divisions, and he mentioned that I was opposing Buthelezi. I was opposing the unity of Black people, etc., because the ANC wanted unity with Buthelezi, and I couldn't believe it. And he then said to me that in South Africa we'll never be able to get away from the internal passports, he called it. In other words, remember I mentioned there were passports between the Bantustans and the white areas? They would never get rid of those pass laws, the internal pass. Well, in the end, the labor movement got rid of it. In 1985, COSATU held up the passports and said, we are getting rid of them in the next 3 months, and that's the end of it. And actually, that actually was the end of the pass laws. We didn't have to wait for Joe Slobo to come back and say, well, it can't be done. You know, the workers went ahead. That evening and the next morning, I had, well, it wasn't a furious argument, but it was a very serious argument with Joe Slobo, the head of the Revolution Committee, the head of the Communist Party. And he said to me, there is no way we can avoid making a deal with Buthelezi. And I said, yes, there's no way we can avoid having to deal with Buthelezi, because he's going to be the major obstruction to us achieving our freedom. He was furious, and I do believe that the expulsion of myself and other groups, other part of the group that I was involved with at that time, was partly linked to the fierce opposition that Buthelezi had to our position. In fact, he took effort to personally denounce me and other people as his personal enemies. And that was published in the South African newspaper.
And the South African Communist Party said there was you first had to have a democratic revolution in South Africa, and then you would have socialism, that was the path to socialism, and that this ANC, which was not a socialist party, not a communist party, was a popular front, would be the way to socialism. Was that part of the ideology of the South African Communist Party, that you had to have a bloc with people like Buthelezi if you're going to develop a democracy in South Africa?
Well, remember that the initial task of the ANC was set out to unite the African people. Well, if you really wanted to unite the African people, you should start from below. In other words, from ordinary working people on the land and in the factories and elsewhere, and unite the Black working class and the appendages to the Black working class, and as one group. Instead of that, the ANC historically has tried to bring together every part of the traditional authorities, the tribal authorities, and the rising Black intellectuals, academics, and all the rest of it. They start from the top down. So that is the view in which unity would be achieved. Now, if you work that way, and the Communist Party absolutely supported the ANC working in that way, because it never put forward any independent program, it identified that, yes, the national question is the only question in South Africa. It has to be resolved first. How do you resolve the national question? And sure enough, it's a massive question. You get Black people in power and everything will change. Well, no one could believe that African leaders would not liberate their own people. Why not? But it's more complicated than that, because as soon as they came close to power, obviously big business wanted to make a deal with them independently of a deal that they would make with the African working class. So we saw the idea was that you would have the ANC in a period of reforms. There'd be a growing economy. African workers would use the newfound trade union rights, and then there'd be a struggle then for socialism. It actually wasn't ever put forward that way, because they didn't like that word socialism right from the beginning. Every African struggle in the rest of Africa mentioned the word socialism, but in South Africa it was only the comrades themselves who used the term socialism. The leaders never used the term socialism, because they knew it was far too alive, far too hot a term to throw around in South Africa, because it would be demanded to be implemented. So what we've seen is a two-stage theory. The first stage was that the ANC came to power. It had a program of reforms. It was called the Reconstruction and Development Program. But within 18 months, it threw out that program out of the window, and it implemented the IMF World Bank program, which is called GEAR, which was a growth, a misnamed growth and development program. And from there on, it's been a neoliberal program with some concessions here and there, but every major reform which the Workers' Party in Brazil managed to carry out has not been even attempted in South Africa. It was regarded as enough just to put a black person in the right place, and then everything would change. You know, our lives and political ideas are not determined by the color of our skin innately. It's a social issue, you know, the ideas we have. It's a class issue. And then if you're not part and loyal to the working class, you will inevitably turn reforms, minor reforms, into counter reforms. And that's what we're living through in South Africa. Counter reforms on and on, with a gradual decay and disintegration of parts of the state and extensive disintegration in society. How do you create socialism out of such disintegration? We have to struggle against capitalism again. In other words, the democratic issues could only really be resolved by the working class coming in and taking power, building a non-racial socialist society, opening up the question of opening up the universities, the schools, and all the rest of it, without throwing people, who in those institutions, the complete despair and into reaction, because there would be a broad social program for all, in which there'd be proper pensions, a living wage, and economic growth in South Africa, which could satisfy all. At the moment, we are pushing a 45% unemployment rate. It's unspeakable. The poverty of our people is increasing. There are handouts from the state, but even that's beginning to break up. This last month, apparently, there were no grants being made in South Africa. The state finances are in a system of complete disintegration. There's no... what happened to deepening democracy? What happened to the second stage? It simply goes right off the agenda. It's not even talked about. No one even could think about it, from the Communist Party, the ANC, or COSATU, the trade union, which is supporting the ANC. Instead of that, we have a political party after the other being formed, most opportunist, disgraceful alliances being made with all kinds of reactionary groups. And Chief Buthelezi is now to be buried with a state funeral, and every single politician in South Africa is praising him to the nth degree. Why? Because they're going to make a deal with this party to get themselves into power. All the ruling strata is feasting at a table in which the wealth of South Africa is presented by the working class. They're feasting, they are eating. And that is a disgrace to the national struggle in South Africa and to the social revolution which is opening up.
And Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, was a trade union leader at one time, who transformed into a capitalist black capitalist. He has the license to McDonald's in South Africa. He was on the board of Lonrho, the platinum mining company, when workers were murdered there. He was instrumental with emails encouraging the police to solve the strike militarily. He's now president of ANC, and also he's the head of ANC and president of the country. And the South African Communist Party, you were at a conference recently in Durban to commemorate the 1973 uprising against apartheid in Durban. And at that conference, there were members of the Communist Party. In fact, the leader of the Communist Party was there defending the ANC and saying that there was democracy. What was your assessment of that conference and the political debate that took place there at that conference?
We faced so many contradictions, really. I mean, it's obvious to all who were present at that conference, and remember that we were having power failures all the time, with the lights going out and then on again and out again. In other words, here was the elite of society. We were meant to be sitting down and discussing the history of our struggle, and we couldn't do so because, you know, the power was going out. And remember, that is a Eskom, our power generator, is absolutely controlled by the ANC. There's nobody else who controls that, and it's had every resource that's been given to it. Now, when we look back on our history, instead of telling the truth and say, look, we made a massive mistake in supporting Buthelezi, how many tens of thousands of the people have been lost? Can we remember Jabu Ndlovu and those who fought at BTR and elsewhere? Instead of anything of that being discussed, we were told that TINA, T-I-N-A, there was no alternative. There is no alternative. There was no alternative. In other words, that what happened has happened, and you could not have done anything else. Well, of course, every day there are alternatives. You can get out of bed and do something. You can read a book. You can write. You can go for a jog. Life is full of choices. Maybe you don't make those choices. Maybe you just let yourself slip into a way of working. And unfortunately, the Minister of, I'm trying to give an exact correct designation, but more or less of economics of the time, Alec Irwin, was in charge of making key decisions in the 1990s, and they carried out a program of deregulation, removing all the tariff policies that were previously in place by the apartheid regime, but are in a sense necessary to the continued development of the textile and clothing industry. And he just removed them quickly, almost immediately, because he said it's better we do this thing quickly than gradually let it change over time. That cost the jobs of something like 28,000 textile workers. The Frame Group, which was the largest textile combine in Africa, one of the largest in the world at that time in the 1970s, eventually was closed out because we had cheap imports coming into South Africa. It devastated the lives of particularly of African women who for the first time had an industrial job and some opportunity. It broke my mother's heart, by the way, because she knew those women and could see what was happening. And I mentioned to the conference that my mother told me that man is not allowed in our house. He's not allowed to put his foot in through the door. And he was he was very offended by that. It was actually true, by the way. He left the conference. Now, imagine, this is a leader of the Communist Party. He denied absolutely that the ANC had ever given support to Buthelezi, although it's all there in African National Congress documents and in the biography of ANC leaders. So we can't deal with the truth. We can't bear the truth, so we're pretending there's another truth. The
leadership of the South African Communist Party was at this conference. And I remember one woman got up and said, "This is democracy. We have democracy in South Africa." I mean, that, I guess they've completed the democracy stage and they're going someplace further.
Well, exactly. But do we have democracy? Look, we do have the right to a free press. and to speech. But what's happened to that press? The press, which under apartheid was actually often expressing itself against apartheid, has been completely bought out by the ANC. So it now carries down the line. It's been bought out, and it puts forward exactly the right protocol all the time. Never critical of the ANC. Is that a free press? Organization, when newspapers report against the ANC, that's partly tolerated, for now. But there's a time limit, to the freedom of press. There's a time limit also on the freedom of workers to express themselves, because, there's social compulsion. You express yourself a little too readily, and you're fired. Now, it's true that there's labor regulations and so forth, but you need a very deep pocket. You need very good lawyers to get anything close to justice in South Africa. And that's not a way in which most workers can proceed. So we are finding our democratic rights being, cut away. And just remember that in the rural areas, the people are still being ruled by chiefs. So you have the pretense of democracy, but as been pointed out by many intelligent political scientists, the rural people are being ruled by the dominant party through the chiefs, because the chiefs are being paid by government, and that is how majorities are assembled out of the votes of rural people.
And the looting of South Africa, the resources, recolonization, workers being forced to go into contract labor. I know Transnet, which was a nationalized company, railroads and ports, is being privatized. They're giving it over to a Philippine company, apparently, which has also been involved in attacking the ILWU in Seattle. They sued the ILWU for $30 million. It seems like international capital has a free hand to basically rip off and destroy all the working conditions, the social benefits in South Africa, and that's being supported by the ANC to allow for capitalism to have full control in South Africa.
Steve, you need to remember that the institutions you've mentioned, Transnet, and then I could add Eskom, which was the instrument of developing a steel industry, of Eskom, which generated power for the industries of South Africa, SAA, which was the airline of the time. All these institutions were the powerhouse of apartheid. They were the basis on which the apartheid state ruled and carried out key economic functions. Now, for some reason, that has now become forgotten. Partly it's a division of the spoils by the ANC. In other words, if you have an uncle who doesn't have a job, but he's got some education, or maybe not any education, he's given a job as a director of one of these state-owned enterprises. So there is no basis, there's no overall plan. And if there even was a plan, there's no implementation of that plan to be able to develop these state-owned enterprises. And tragically, if we take Transnet, something like 90% of the railway system in South Africa is inoperative. There's incredible looting. Even through syndicates operating in South Africa, trains have been derailed. I couldn't believe it when I read it, and I didn't believe it until I read all the detail of it. If you do not make deals with these syndicates, they will then derail the trains. And previously we had something called the railway police. They were apartheid criminals, yes, because I suffered at their hand often. But at least it was a police system which tried to maintain control over the rail system. Now anything goes. As the system crashes, so in other words, the public sector fails, so then suddenly everything's privatized. No consultation with the workers, no negotiation with the unions. Suddenly it's announced that the whole management of Pier 2, which handles 46% of all imports and exports from South Africa, and by the way, throughout Africa, because it's, Durban is the major port of Southern Africa, that is now to be privatized, to be handed over to this company you mentioned, Steve. Now, they say it's not privatization because it's a joint venture. well, if you had a strong state, yes, maybe you could make some sort of deal with, on IT or something, but it's actually the other way around. And so even though it's called a joint venture, we know that it's now going to be a 20-year joint venture, and maybe at the end of that, and probably even before that, it'll be given complete control, over Pier 2 and Pier 1 and the Port of Durban. And we know that the way in which they'll implement their policies is by ruthless exploitation of workers, hiring and firing, and bringing in all the apparatus of modern management, of brutal modern management against the working class, which, by the way, was the very working class which was struggling against apartheid all the time, and which Buthelezi so abused.
And also the recent conference of BRICS in Johannesburg in South Africa, and this integration with the BRICS economic structure. China, as a result of joining the WTO, had access to the garment industry in South Africa. In Cape Town, large amounts of cheap Chinese garments went into South Africa, destroyed the textile industry. Is China doing anything different in South Africa as far as the development of South Africa?
Steve, money has its own rules, you see. Even if it's called American money, if it's called Chinese money or Russian money, EU money or so forth, it has to seek a maximum profit. And what's happening now is, let's take away the adjectives and say it was Chinese or something else like that. It's under the present conditions where you have massive accumulation of capital, as you see in China at the moment, resulting from trade. But let's remind ourselves, not just from trade, from the exploitation of the Chinese working class, which has gone through decades of extreme exploitation, which is struggling now. Remember, in China, workers actually have to buy their own house if you want to live in a house with any security. And so, as in America, the workers are having to invest in their houses. 70% of investment of the Chinese working people is in housing. That's their own house. And 67% in America. That's shares and so forth are not really the main stock of wealth of working people. Now, when there's investment in South Africa or Namibia or in the DRC or anywhere in Africa or anywhere in the world, we now see the most flagrant exploitation of working people. We have had Chinese companies in South Africa for some time, in parts of KwaZulu-Natal. And the first thing that's happened is that the minimum wage goes out the window. It's a rate for the job. In other words, if you do so many trousers, you paid per trouser, and the hours can go because you're voluntarily there. So in other words, you're there to make your maybe you got to do 56 trousers a day or so forth. So if you want to work till midnight doing 56 is up to you. So all of that is being implemented, the most rapacious exploitation of African workers, particularly African women in the garment industry. And some of those, many of those companies in South Africa, which were not exactly light on exploitation, but did have some protection. In the garment industry, we fought for a medical aid scheme for dentists to be provided for workers, for scholarships for students of the families. The wages were low and indefensibly low, but we did try and make up partly through that by joint contributions from the employers and so forth to pensions and other benefits for the workers. And that helped a whole generation of workers, develop and try and improve their lives. That was smashed. And it brings tears to my eyes to go to a place like Pinetown, which is near Durban, and there were massive frame factories. All of those have now been turned into recruiting places of labor brokerages, of tiny little companies which are employing one or two. It's tragic beyond belief to see the devastation of industry in South Africa.
And the apartheid regime used contract labor for the workers in the mines, workers in the ports. It seems like the apartheid system, economic system anyway, as far as contract labor, is now starting to dominate the working class in South Africa, Namibia, all of Africa.
Yeah, well, just let's look at this in terms of the contract labor system in the past. Now, I know that was applied particularly to African workers and not necessarily to white and to other race groups, but it was, in a sense, a fixed term contract. You were not allowed to work more than 11 hours. You were then held to work for 11 hours, but you could be fired at any moment. It was that kind of a fixed term contract. In other words, it was really formalization of a form of casual labor. You were employed when they wanted. They could change the minimum wage within some certain limits. I mean, there were meant to be minimum wages, but you could change that by mutual agreement, or the workers just being forced to accept it. Now we are seeing another form of contract labor. In some ways, something similar, except that the length of the contract is maybe unsure. You're not sure whether it's 11 months. You're not sure if it's 2 months. It may be even day by day that you're being employed. So that's the length of your job, and that is being implemented in many sectors. And it really devastates the lives of ordinary people. How on earth can you manage under those conditions? And so we've got to fight this system tooth and nail. We've got to create a new vision for society in which investment is, for the social benefit of people and not for maximizing profits, and to be able to put an end to the looting of our state-owned enterprises and the rapacious exploitation of workers in the docks and the mines and elsewhere. Mm-hmm.
Well, the EFF has presented itself as an alternative to the ANC. And what is its relationship to this issue of contract labor and privatization of South Africa?
Steve, the EFF, that's freedom fighters, economic freedom fighters, is very radical. Radical in the sense of being radical in rhetoric rather than radical in going to the fundamentals. The idea of radicalism in Marxism or in rigorous social analysis is to get to the foundations of that society. Radicalism, in the EFF, is that you do not like this company. It made a statement. Sometimes they do make the most terrible statements, but how do you respond to it? You go and smash it. You smash the windows, you steal the stuff there, and so on. You ruin the lives of working people in that, so they lose their jobs, or their life is made a misery. And by the way, after doing that, a white company, usually it's a white company, will then say, maybe we need some more black managers and so forth, and some of your EFF people get jobs. It's disgraceful. It seems radical. It attracts a lot of the youth because they think, oh, well, the ANC is a organization, a trade union for older people. In other words, if you want to get wealth, you can try the ANC. The Communist Party is also a way in which you can get wealth, because you can get contracts to do different things, or to be able to form a company and loot a little bit yourself. Now the EFF's being kept out of that for now, but now here's the golden chance. You can also do the same. And although it's at times it said it's against corruption, it looted a building society, which is in a type of bank in one of the Bantustans, and it never was. I don't know what's happened with the prosecution. It was meant to start, but it's never really happened, and they sort of got away with it. Amazingly, most of the leaders get very expensive cars, watches, and houses. Where the money comes from, we're not meant to ask. So it does try, and it speaks a language of change, or even of revolution, and it talks about oppressed black workers. It's always it doesn't seek to get, obviously, to build workers' unity, but it does seem a radical answer. But it's another form of division in the black working class. It's it's looking opportunistically to make alliances to get into power in local government and in national government. It makes deals, by the way, with the big bourgeois party, the real capitalist party, the DA, in some cases. Then it changes its mind and makes a deal with the ANC. I mean, it's all the movement to and fro of opportunist capitalist politics, as you'll find in any country in the world, except it's given a radical chic. Mm-hmm.
And I know that they had an alliance with the ANC in Johannesburg for the ANC to keep in power. They had an alliance with the EFF. So I guess their opportunism to stay in power, get a piece of power, is primary. If they say they're against the ANC and they're united with the ANC to keep in power, it seems like a contradiction in terms, for that organization.
Yeah, I think that that alliance actually broke down in Johannesburg, and now there's some other group. I mean, there's splintering of all the national groups. It's very hard to keep up with it. But the devastation of that is the primary, well, let's say that the premier city of Africa. At one time, this was where wealth was concentrated in South Africa. I'm talking about downtown Johannesburg, not Sandton, the suburb. And if you go there now, the street signs have gone. There's rubbish everywhere. There's prostitutes lining the streets. It's not. People even stop me from getting out of the car to take a picture because it seemed to be so dangerous. It's devastated. Recently, we had 73 people dying in a fire in a building. And it was found that it had been taken over by gangsters. The gangsters then charged the people an amount each month. They put in hundreds of people into that building, which was never designed, to provide accommodation. And when a fire broke out, the people were locked in. Were found that they'd been locked in because they didn't want people getting out of that system. So, it was devastating. The other day. Just a few days before that, the streets blew up. Streets blowing up. How did that happen? Well, apparently there was a gas leak right down a gas pipe from one end of the city center to the other. Cars being thrown into buildings and so forth. Oh, Steve, it breaks my heart to even tell you all this.
This is Johannesburg.
It's really low.
This is Johannesburg.
Oh gosh.
So in San Francisco, where I'm doing the interview, the situation with the homeless, people in tents, and then you've got the Democrats, the Democratic mayor, and the governor saying we need more police. We got to kick people off their tents, kick people off the streets. When you have 16,000 empty flats in San Francisco, speculators buying property, and yet massive homeless, mental ill problems, ill, homeless. It seems like it's an international issue. And the recent commemoration of the coup in Chile and the role of the AFL-CIO, it seems like there's a similarity in the history of how the AFL-CIO was involved in South Africa and involved in Chile in supporting, in Chile, Pinochet, in supporting the coup, and in South Africa, supporting the Buthelezi, and which led to the massacre of thousands of trade unions and workers.
We need to know, Steve. I mean, do we have the privilege of the truth? We demand it. They must open the books. We want to see those files. We'd like to know what actually happened. Where did our tax money go? Who were our friends? Who were our enemies? Let's learn about this, and to be able to speak the truth, and to be able to pass that on to our fellows and to our kids. We've been through hell in South Africa. Apartheid was it was a system of devastation for African people and for real disorientation and corruption among white people. We now ended up with the most unequal society in the world. Can you believe it? That is 30 years after apartheid was formally ended. It's more unequal now than it was then. Beyond belief. What's happening, I could explain it further. It's just higher levels of unemployment. That means working class don't have income. Greater share ownership and increased sharing out of the wealth at the top of society, in the top 5 and 10%, yes. And so therefore, it's not surprising there's great inequalities. That's what it is. Wealth is being unequally distributed. And that means that we have 25,000 murders a year, Rape is at a high level and increasing. Violence against anyway, all the mess of society is coming back. We were a bit relieved at the end of apartheid. Things started to improve a little bit, and then now we have thrown right back to where we came from.
Well, it seems in South Africa and the United States, the issue of a workers' party, a labor party that has a program for the working class is the same issue. There's a political vacuum
exactly
in South Africa,
and
political vacuum in the United States.
Yeah, you see, we South Africa. It's quite a major society, and we're looking at 60 million people. It's not a small country in that sense, but we are isolated to some extent. We looked traditionally, we've looked to Britain, to Europe, to see what's happening there, and there has been, the Labour Party in the past supported the ANC, and there were those kind of relationships. But what we desperately need is to be able to define our interests as a working people, and define what the future of our country should be. And for the country, for all the countries of Southern Africa, remember, apartheid was built on the labor of all the Southern African people as well as the South African people. We sometimes forget that, but we need to be reminded of that quite firmly. And then we need to define that to be able to put the real majority of society, which is working people. There's like 0.1%, or even 0.001% of society are actually business people who are actually owning major shares in companies, or even owning the companies themselves. That is, it's a tiniest people. Ordinary working people actually do understand we need to work together in different ways, but to be united as working people and around the working class, which is incredibly productive in South Africa. There's all kinds of ideas about improving society, and has got the strength to make the change. And that's what we look to see in America. Maybe now with this strike taking place, we can see that workers are putting forward demands for 40%. It's incredible. In South Africa, when the workers demanded 20% increase on the mines a while ago, it was said absolutely impossible, beyond understanding, and so forth. And yet, it was entirely possible because of the profits of the mine. Our wages are determined by the strength of our organization. To be able to organize and to be able to change the ratio between wages and profits, and to turn that into a living reality, and to be able to return increasing amounts of the wealth to ordinary working people. And in the end, actually, because of the violence of the state, we do need to take over society and to be able to reconstruct it in the image of our better future.
I want to thank you very much. We've been talking with David Hemson, was an organizer of the dock workers and other workers in Durban, was a researcher, took up a fight in the ANC, has been fighting to get the truth out about what happened in South Africa, and most immediately talking about the death of Buthelezi and what his real record was in South Africa. So thanks for joining us on Work Week.
Thanks, Steve.
Good. Take care.